learn from stars and heroes of the Dubai business world. Welcome to the Dubai Business Podcast, produced by Jayed. Now, here's your host, Biancka Gracia.
Whether the economy is booming or collapsing, you need a good lawyer. That's what my today's guest told me a few days back when we were preparing for this episode. Biancka Gracia is a general counsel and suits advisor, and today we will talk about what do startups need to consider when it comes to legal questions, what to keep in mind when you're founding a startup, how to set up agreements with your co-founders, or what to do when you're getting investors on board, or how to actually find a good lawyer. As she mentions, when you take care of these things at the beginning of your startup journey, it can save you a lot of time, hassle, and money. Here's my conversation with Biancka Gracia. Biancka, welcome to Dubai Business Podcast. Thank you very much for making your time for this episode. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Lucas.
When we were preparing for this interview, you said whether the economy is booming or collapsing, you need a good lawyer. So I wanted to start with a question. How did your work actually change in the past few months?
Well, we did start advising businesses in two ways, or I should say entrepreneurs in two ways. One where normal employees had lost their jobs and they actually took a leap, like the founders of Airbnb, might I add, and they decided to start their own businesses. So there we were advising entrepreneurs on incorporating or structuring new businesses. And where businesses were already operating, they came to us to restructure their businesses to possibly go online or adopt other contingency plans. So yes, we weren't out of business during the past 5 months, safe to say.
Yeah. Was there something unexpected, let's say, in the legal area, which you maybe haven't faced before, and this unique situation kind of brought it to you?
Well, I would say the fact that the COVID situation was a global situation, it did not affect one particular area or one particular country, rather it affected the whole world. That took us by a little bit of surprise. So whether you were waking up in Chicago or you were waking up in Dubai, you still had to go about your day with certain restrictions. You could or could not run your business with certain restrictions. So that was something that caught us by surprise. And also the fact that only services could actually streamline and move their businesses online, whereas those who had products to sell, they were caught completely unaware, and there was little we could do as legal advisors to help advise them on minimizing their legal risks, because what else can you say? Don't sell your products. That's all they have to sell.
Yeah. Did you have to take some precautions or steps on your side as your company internally? Was there something new, something unexpected for you internally?
Yes, so we anticipated this going much worse from the end of January, you could say, because we had already heard whispers. So we immediately moved into our contingency plan, and we asked most of our clients to start communicating with us online. We didn't announce it because announcements always scare people. And they always put them on high alert. So we gradually started moving all our meetings online and started encouraging our clients to communicate with us more over the phone, over video calls, over email. So we were minimally affected when lockdown hit us end of March.
Okay, so you kind of trained your clients before when you saw something like this might be coming. How was it for you in a legal area where people need to build a lot of trust, I believe, and especially in our region where the personal contact is really important? How was this shift to the remote meetings with clients?
Well, it was quite welcome, actually. Like I said, we did not make an announcement, because when you make an announcement and you say to people, look, we just want to let you know we're doing something special and different because we anticipate something in the future, that would actually scare them, as opposed to we just did it in a very subtle manner where we said, hey, in order to save time, why don't we just get on the phone, now and let me help you get this issue sorted out as soon as possible in the interest of time, so you don't have to wait for 3 days to meet me, for example. And clients were quite actually receptive when we spoke to them in a time sensitive manner, and we spoke to them with good customer service. They saw it as good customer service, where we were trying to resolve their issues for them in a much faster or swifter manner as opposed to days.
Yeah, I see. So I guess this is something you're not really changing back even after all the thing about pandemic is gone. So I believe you will not go back to doing everything in person, right?
I can only say, Lucas, inshallah, but we don't know. We don't know what the future has planned. I mean, people did get used to meeting online, and it's so much easier. It saves time. It saves a lot of hassle, but I do think a lot of business owners in the UAE are used to actually meeting in person. So once this whole thing has died down and business goes back to normal life, yes, we will continue meeting online, but we may have to also meet in person. We can't avoid it.
Let's see. So Biancka, today we mainly wanted to discuss the legal journey of startup, let's call it, and let's start really at the beginning when we are founding a startup. When I want to start my own company, I have this brilliant idea. I believe I will be next Uber, next Kareem, next Angami, whatever. What should be the first steps from the legal point of view? Do I need a lawyer, for example, for the very first step of establishing the company, or I can do it on my own as a founder?
Well, I always have this saying, it's always cheaper and even free if you hire a lawyer before you actually go and mess up things for yourself. Because when you're in the middle of the mess, then you can't control the fees really, because you've got yourself in the mess. So I'd say before you actually start up, there are a few things you should always keep in mind. Think about the structure. Just don't go and set up a company in foreign jurisdictions, call that a holding company, and set up another company, operational company here. Think about your costs. Think about where you want to set up, what activity you need to have, and which jurisdiction would be most cost efficient for you and effective for the kind of activity you want to provide. Create a business plan, understand your demographic, who are your consumers. Also, if you create a business plan, don't create a business plan for 1 year or 2 years. Try to create it for 5 years, because for the first 2 years, for example, you're only starting your operations. And for the next 3 years, you'll be scaling up. So that will give you a good idea of whether you want to bring in investment, you want to bring in investors. Having a business plan gives you an objective. Another thing I would highlight to startups, entrepreneurs in particular, is if you are on an employment contract and you want to set up your own business, check if you need to get an NOC from your employer or from your sponsor. And also another thing that I would put out there is check all the timings for all the processes that are involved, because when entrepreneurs find out that a bank account takes about 2 months to set up, it always surprises them. But it does take about 2 months to set up a bank account. So these are minor timelines, processes that founders need to take into account.
Yeah. I know from my own experience in the last 6 months, I've set up 2 companies, and to really orient in the UAE system where we have so many free zones and so many options, it's not really easy. What are the main differences, or what should I consider as a startup when I'm deciding which free zone to register with? Because the fees are really big, can be really different. So what do I need to consider from the legal perspective?
That's actually a very valid question, and a question that a lot of founders don't think about. So the first thing I would say is understand your activity and your demographic. If, for example, you want to sell hand washing products, a soap solution in the UAE, if you are going to distribute it directly to consumers here in the UAE, then you ideally need to have a mainland license, which is either mainland in any of the Emirates, because you're trading products directly on the mainland. If, for example, you want to provide services only within a particular free zone or to clients that are based outside of the UAE, then it's ideal that you set up in a free zone. Whilst the free zone can give an expat like yourself or me 100% ownership, legally speaking, you can only function within that free zone. You cannot really function outside. You cannot come on mainland and say, I'm providing you the services. However, the gray area is if somebody from mainland approaches you, they can come to you in the free zone and buy that service or product from you off the free zone. So these are main things you need to consider. What is your activity and who are you providing it to?
Okay, absolutely. Is there something else maybe you see that the startups or starting companies are underestimating in this area and then they are struggling with it and that's where they need to pay those fees because they are in a mess already?
Yes, I'd say especially for tech startups, they underestimate the debugging and the testing phases of their MVP before going live. That's something they grossly underestimate. So if a realistic plan is put into place, I review several tech software development contracts. And the one thing I see that isn't in those contracts are testing and debugging phases. They have a great plan and a great timeline for actually developing the MVP, but when it comes to testing and debugging, it's something, I don't know why, they conveniently overlook it. Also, most of them don't have contracts in place with their suppliers or their developers or even their clients. Or they don't even think it's important or necessary. So I think it's very important that you look into who's going to be working with you, what terms they're going to be working with you on. That's critical. And another thing I'd mention is when you're hiring employees or getting into a relationship with anybody for any phase of your business, make sure that person has the background. So if you're hiring somebody to do finance, make sure they are in the financial background or they have a degree at least in finance. Don't hire somebody who's just been serving coffee all his life and you make him your finance manager. That's a recipe for disaster right there.
Yeah, that's probably a good start of to problems. Maybe let's go back to when you said to think of the debugging phase. I believe there you're referring basically the relationship between a startup and your supplier, the developers, right? So what you're saying, just to kind of rephrase it for the audience, is that very often the startups forget to include, let's say, in the contract, if there's a contract, they forget to include the debugging phase to make sure that the product they receive from their developers is actually working as it should be.
Exactly. You said it better than I did, Lucas. Thank you.
I'm just trying to rephrase it to make sure that even people with non-technical background can understand it. So what is the best practice for that? Do you include in contracts like some kind of guarantees, or how to make sure that actually what I receive from developers will be working?
So let me take a cue off you and let me say it in as simple English as I can in a non-legalese way. Think about the worst case scenarios. I like to call them what if scenarios. If you make a list of your worst case scenarios, what could go wrong? What if this happened? What if that happened? And if you address that in your contract, have a backup plan or a plan B, I think you're pretty much covered in that case.
Okay, so creating the list of worst case scenarios and having that kind of covered in a contract would be the way. All right. Any one more topic which usually startups need to tackle at the beginning is when you have multiple co-founders in the beginning. What, from your experience, is the right setup to avoid problems in the future?
Right. The most common problem that I come across is they don't know how much to give whom, how much equity to give which founder. So the first thing I ask them is, if you want to decide how much to give each founder, you need to sit down with the financial advisor and create a valuation. In simple, if I have to use simple analogy, if you don't know how much the whole cake costs, how will you split it up and sell the slices? So it's critical for them to understand first, even if it's a business idea or a business that they are going to form, how much is that business going to be worth as soon as you incorporate the company, for example. And depending on the contribution of each shareholder, bearing in mind that tangible and intangible contributions have a value, you can then apportion the shareholding or equity. But I'd say apportion equity with a lot of care and diligence, because getting into a business it's even more difficult to get out of it than a Roman Catholic marriage. It's quite difficult.
Yeah, do you usually see there are some kind of agreements or contracts between shareholders on top of what is required by free zone or by the authorities? Because especially in our regions, very often the shareholders are people from very different backgrounds, while if you have startup in US, then probably they will be kind of knowledgeable about how the system works. But here we can have two parties or multiple parties from very different backgrounds. So are there usually some contracts between the shareholders to tackle this?
Yeah, so typically you would have a shareholders agreement, like you said. However, it really depends who that shareholder is. For example, if it's an employee, for example, and they're not really a shareholder, but they're part of an employee stock option program where they're getting kind of shares in a complementary manner, the kind of plan or agreement you'd have with them would be very different compared to an investor who's coming in. An investor who's coming in on an equity plan getting shareholding would not only have a shareholding agreement, he'd have a term sheet as well. And then if you think about somebody who you get into partnership with and who you decide to set up a company with, you'd have a co-founders agreement with them first, and then perhaps a shareholders agreement. So it really depends what is the nature of relationship you have with that particular partner, and then you decide how many more agreements you need to have. One more thing I'd like to mention, Lucas, is if at all that particular shareholder wears more than one hat, if he's a shareholder, a director, and an employee, then they may have an employment contract and they may have an agreement to be a director as well.
Okay. And I guess you would recommend to putting any agreement between shareholders on paper, don't kind of leave it just like
yes,
that.
Absolutely. They definitely need to have an agreement in place, because if there is no agreement, then it becomes a matter of he said, she said, and then where do you go to find the grounds of that relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, let's say we have our tech startup now up and running. One thing when I think from the user perspective are all the terms and conditions where the first probably thought of a startup might be, okay, let's take something which exists and we just edit it to our needs. Is there something specific to our market, to our region, which probably we should consider and rather make our own terms and conditions which are tailored to the region?
Now, are you talking about website terms and conditions, or are you talking about a standard contract that one would sign with suppliers or customers?
Let's say we are a startup who's providing some services to end customers. So we are a B2C tech startup, and so for that we need some T's and C's on the website or in our mobile app. So I'm talking about that case.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, actually. I was just off the phone this morning also with another client who asked me whether it was okay for them to just copy website terms and conditions. And I said, as a lawyer, I would lose my license if I had to advise you to copy terms and conditions. So the best thing for you to do would be to actually put down headings, clause, write down exactly what the website is for, all about, what you're providing on the website, what you can do and what you can't do. Think of the website as your little kingdom, and you as a founder are a king or queen of that kingdom. So what are the terms or rules on which people can enter your kingdom and leave your kingdom, and what can they do and can't they do in your kingdom? So if you have a fair idea of that, then you can easily put down terms and conditions of your website on a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When I see it, for example, in comparison with Europe, where Europe seems to be very, let's say, harsher in terms of privacy, given GDPR and all these things. Would you say like it's a bit easier in our region, or is there a big difference in these things?
I would say that privacy has been overlooked by the masses, even though it's such an important topic that has been covered right from the UAE constitution that governs and protects privacy to the UAE penal code, the UAE civil code, all the important laws, if you look at them, they have got sections regarding privacy and governing privacy right from the early years in the UAE. So whilst GDPR may have just come out recently in the European Union, and I think it's been publicized greatly, we have always had privacy laws in each and every law, major law in this country. It's just not as publicized, but the importance is still there, I'd say.
Yeah, I noticed it during some discussions that many people in the region and many people from with marketing background don't really understand even like the definition of spam. They think that sending people to random users is absolutely okay. And it seems there's a lack of knowledge in this area that it's actually not okay. And the laws in UAE are ready for it or are made for this already.
Yes, I think it's quite important for businesses to understand, or even ad agencies or marketing agencies to understand that it is not okay to sell databases. It's not okay to share in private or personal information or data or contact somebody without their permission. And you're right when you say they do send out a lot of newsletters. They subscribe you to. I myself get so many newsletters. I'm subscribed to newsletters on a regular basis without even actually putting my name out there. So I can only imagine it's because personal data is being exchanged there without permission. So the more aware people are becoming of it, the better it is, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, when we move on in a life stage of our imaginary startup now, I guess the next moment I might need a lawyer is when I start looking for first funding. And I believe that there can be many things that I as a founder can do that will harm my chances of getting a good investor. So what would be your advices at that moment?
Well, the first thing I'd say, put in place, like I've said before, have a business plan. Make sure you have a 5-year business plan. The second thing you need to make sure of is you have a data room, an online data room in the cloud where you have saved all the contracts you signed, whether it's an employment contract, it's a shareholder agreement, if it's a simple non-disclosure agreement. Make sure you have an online data room where everything is saved. And the third thing I'd say, make sure you've got all your accounting in order on a trusted software that you can actually pull out reports. This will show any investor, whether it's an angel investor or an institutional investor, that you are a professional organization and you mean business.
It reminded me with the online data room a question whether it's really still necessary for many companies to store all those papers in their closet and hope that it will not, come into fire or something, or if storing documents online is nowadays absolutely sufficient from the legal perspective.
It's absolutely fine. We have an electronic transactions law, in fact, that allows us to communicate online and have communications online in the UAE. And it's perfectly fine to have documents stored online. Even if you sign documents on paper, you can definitely scan them and store them online. I'm a big fan of going green myself, and I believe in not having those cupboards full of dusty papers that you accumulate over the years.
Yeah, okay, that's great news. So this probably should be the part we will highlight because, yeah, I'm personally a bit allergic to signing all those papers by my hand, and it's getting crazy sometimes. So when we have the contract, when we have all the contracts, when we have all the accountings, then when you see startups getting funding, do you see any other mistakes or any other areas where they really need help, maybe to set up the right agreement with the investor or something around that?
Yeah, I always tell startups, wait until you find the right type of investor. Don't preempt the kind of investor you're going to get and prepare agreements in advance, because you never know whether you're going to get an investor who's an angel investor, or he's based in Silicon Valley, or it's an institutional investor from the Middle East, perhaps. Because depending on the type of investor, you may need to tweak the kind of documents. I've seen investors from Silicon Valley are very familiar with the SAFE document that was drafted by Y Combinator. However, if you look at the UAE, the angel investors are not very familiar with the SAFE. They prefer convertible notes, which are more secure and more detail oriented rather than SAFEs. So it really depends who your investor is. I'd say wait till you find the right kind of investor. However, no matter which investor you approach, if they are professional enough, they will always sign a non-disclosure agreement or a confidentiality agreement before you actually go and disclose to them your idea or sensitive information about your company.
Mm-hmm. One thing you just reminded me, one thing which I would say many founders are really surprised at the moment they start looking for funding, and that's they very often they don't really budget for the legal cost associated with getting the funds. Is there any way how I can do that? How I can budget this cost related to raising?
Yes, that's a very good question. I'd say approach at least 3 or 4 different lawyers that work or have worked on startups before, because the way startups work and the way they get their investment is very different to the way matured businesses would get, say, acquired or investment. So work with lawyers, get fee quotes from lawyers in the region. If you are a startup in the region, get a fee quotes from lawyers in the region, ideally in dirhams, not in any other currency, and keep an average of that perhaps as legal costs. And always try and keep a buffer about 10 or 15%, because you never know what may come up here and there. Maybe you've not budgeted for paying the regulatory authority to have the documents changed once the incoming investor comes in, or the regulatory authority maybe changes their fees. So it's always good to keep a 10 to 15% additional as a buffer.
Okay, since you mentioned it, when I reach out to those 3 different, let's say, lawyers, what would you recommend me to consider when I'm choosing a lawyer for my startup?
Well, the first thing I would recommend is something that you pointed out earlier, that the lawyer should speak clear English or a clear language that you understand as a founder. If they speak legalese, then you're on a completely different planet than they are, and you will never understand what they're advising you. Also, select an advisor that thinks out of the box, that understands you're a startup, they get involved in your business, that they don't just draft documents when you tell them to draft documents. If a lawyer doesn't ask to see your business plan, how your business operates, whether you have insurances in place, he doesn't ask to see perhaps the terms with your investors, and that's not a lawyer who's thinking out of the box. Also, if you can get the lawyer to agree on maybe favorable payment plans for yourself, or offer you a fixed fee where you know your fees are capped, you don't have to pay exorbitant fees. Try and avoid paying on an hourly basis, because that means you'll never know how much you will end up paying. So try and fix your fees or cap your fees in some way. And if the lawyer is good, maybe they'll even offer you an installment plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is this, by the way, something I should budget? Because you were mentioning P&L or business plan from the beginning. Is basically legal something I should budget from day one into my business plan?
Well, ideally, if you are thinking of starting on a professional note and continuing, having a legal advisor on your side would go a very big way. It's ideal that you have a budget, but if you can't afford it, then I guess you'd have to make provision for it at a later stage.
Okay, so having it kind of incorporated in my business plan from the beginning, there's probably no harm in that. All right. Biancka, in the end, let's kind of summarize it to some call to action to startup founders, to really people who are now considering starting their own business, but this legal area and let's say the bureaucracy in the region is one of the reasons why they are a bit hesitant to do so. So what would be your call to action, your advice to those people?
Well, I would say if you're thinking of setting up a business, the two people that you need to be, or rather three people you need to meet are one, a company setup agent who can advise you on the various options available for incorporation that are cost effective and also effective in terms of your activity, what activity you require. The second person you need to meet are a lawyer or lawyers who will be able to advise you on the risks in your particular business plan or business idea, what documents you need to think about signing, creating. Most lawyers that I know would even offer a complimentary session to actually meet them and just have a generic chat. The third person you should definitely meet, and think of these people like doctors before you actually having your immunity shot, before you actually go and get a deadly virus. The third person you should meet is a financial advisor who can help you put into place the actual finances that you require. So you know whether or not you can put together enough of money to conduct the business. Because simply put, if you can't put together enough of operational costs for the first 2 years at least, don't start the business.
That makes sense. All right, Biancka, thank you very much for your time. It was full of advices and in the end in very simple English. So I believe everyone in the audience will benefit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for having me. Thank you very much.
You can tell that Biancka is really passionate about startups and she knows what she's talking about. That's why she is also a mentor for many of them under In5 or Dubai Development Authority. If you need to ask any specific questions, you can do that in comments or find Biancka's LinkedIn profile and this episode show notes on our website. And that will be it for today. On behalf of our producer Arshak Ismail, thank you for listening and we will talk to you very soon.
This was the Dubai Business Podcast produced by Jayid. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform and on social media at jayid.co/podcast. That's JAYID.co/podcast.